Hello. Can everybody hear me? Good? Okay, perfect. So I wanted to just say thank you all for having me up here, and we're going to keep this pretty quick, and if not, Tom's going to play the organ, and I'll hear that, and I'll run back to my little pew there. But I think what's interesting, so I'm an architect. I've been an architect for 20 years. I actually am licensed, but I don't practice anymore. I'm a real estate developer, which is kind of like an architect, but now I have to take care of my buildings and pay for them, which is actually a nice segue into why we're here talking about this incredible piece of architecture and what it takes to maintain it. I'll kind of break today's just brief thing into three parts. What is the history of this building, and not just this building, but this style? That's really, the context is key. How are those details in this church, and why is this actually so unique? And then why is the maintenance and stewardship of these historic buildings so critical? So I think the caveat is that anytime you talk about history, you're trying to tell the whole story. You're trying to explain, effectively illustrate the tree to somebody. Here's this beautiful tree. But you can go down into one of the roots and never come back out. So you have to kind of keep this framework. And so I'm going to give you a little bit of the background, a little bit of the details, and we can always talk a little bit more about the rich details about American church design. So really, with any building, there's a contract between the building owner and the building itself. It's really if that contract is honored, it's almost a covenant, the church or the building can go on for decades, if not years, which is why you see certain communities pinpoint certain key buildings that cannot be torn down, must be maintained, and when you think of that town, you think of those buildings, and they define your memory of that town. A lot of churches become that memorial for that town and for those places. This building specifically, you talk about the roots of the tree. This building is the New England style of architecture, which for me as a Midwesterner, I'm not that interested in New England, but it is the original design of church. It is original church design, the original theme of churches in the entire country. It was the first. And I think it's important, whoever designed this church in the 70s, after we lost the first one, knew exactly what they were doing and really honored that original tradition. It comes from the Puritan congregational movement, which many of you know. Congregational is from the Puritan movement. They were the people who came over with the Pilgrims. They weren't the Pilgrims, but they were very similar to them. And they all landed in New England. Massachusetts and Connecticut were kind of the heart of it, the beginning. And it was coming from, this is probably in the late 1600s, so 100 years before our country became a nation, and the early 1700s. That's when the Puritans really set their mark. And they were doing something that was not unusual. They were blending churches and government, which is what everyone in Europe had been doing for 1,000 years. And but what they were doing with their churches is they were blending the notion that this was both a meeting place and a house of worship. So those first towns, Salem, Plymouth, Boston, those churches were also where the town meetings happened. And so I think you all kind of get that feeling when you're here. We meet, we converse, we raise our hands, we pray, we make decisions. So, and of course, separation of church and state didn't become part of the government until 100 years later. So there's a lot to talk about there, but we won't go into that. But this is really, the Puritan movement was kind of a rebellion against the Church of England, and the Church of England was a rebellion against the Roman Catholic Church. So they came over here, they created these places, and they went against everything that was European church architecture. And you can look around this room and you can see that. This is kind of an Enlightenment structure where they were seeking individuality, autonomy, kind of clarity of voice, simplicity. They were going against the established old order. And kind of the way they were getting rid of the stained glass. They were getting rid of the long nave that you would see in an old basilica, which is what all the churches were built on, these sort of structured hierarchies. You enter through the door, the apse, and the altar right here, the throne. Ironically, we had a throne here just about 10 minutes ago. And you would take that procession, and that was this power dynamic. You were the small, lowly parishioner, and there's this temporal authority standing at the center of the church. You couldn't see outside. It was just these stained glass windows. and your place was to be humble. So the Puritans said, no, well, we are all individuals. We are all sort of special in our own way. We believe in the Enlightenment. We believe in the purity of the gospel, so we're going to just celebrate that. So they had, and this is really kind of the core of this, they created a space that was a square. It wasn't the long rectangle. That they created clear glass windows, flat ceilings, no ornamentation, simplicity. You could have a meeting there. You could have any church function that defined your American ideals. And ours is not exactly like that. The interior is classic congregational, kind of root Puritan, but the outside kind of reflects what happened right after the Puritans got there. The European ways came back, and you had this, instead of having the square church with the belfry at top, simple clapboard walls, suddenly you had classic ornamentation out front. You had the columns come back. You had this belfry shift to the front, and you ended up with this tower. And so we are kind of, the outside of our church represents kind of the American evolution of congregational. You have that sort of grand front, but once you get on the inside, this is about as classic as a Puritan meeting house as you can get, which I think is really, really cool. And so I'll talk a little bit about why that's so important. And part of why that's so important is you can just see it in the light. You can go to almost any church in Minnesota or America, and there will either be no windows, which is very common in non-denominational, or there will be stained glass windows. But to have that simple daylight coming through, you can see out into the community can see into here, that transparency is exactly what the Puritans are going for. And for some reason, church design just doesn't let daylight in. It doesn't let pure views in. And if you're somebody who really feels kind of spirituality when you're in nature, you can see the trees, you can see the birds, and you can feel everything that is kind of the beauty of the natural world. And so I think feeling that connection to God and each other, the way these churches are set up, we are all sitting here and we can all look around and see each other. In the classic congregational churches, it wasn't the march of pews. The pews wrapped the altar. The altar was just a simple member of the community as the pastor. But they were so effective in uniting the people in the room that I think it was the old Boston church, I think it was called the Old South Meeting House. They had a meeting there in the church, and it turned into the Boston Tea Party. And they marched to the harbor, and that was the beginning of American history. I think we have a harbor here, too, but I don't think we're going to throw anything in. But and so I think when you walk in here, know that this is really, really a unique part of American history, but it's also unique in our current modern church design. You can't really find a form, a layout, and this type of sort of light coming in, and it really defines kind of the root of who we are when we moved, when all of our ancestors came to this country. And so I think you get to the next piece, which is, great, you have a beautiful building. It represents beautiful ideals. But as a historian, you're kind of talking from the pages of a book. As an architect, you're speaking to a building that you're going to design and build. But the hardest part might actually be the building owner. And I really mean this as somebody who has to do this for my profession. The building owner sees the building as a partner, and that partner requires a lot of work, a lot of care. It's not really unlike raising a child or taking care of an elderly parent. And to be a good partner to that partner requires money, time, and honestly, experience and expertise. It's very hard to manage a building without that experience. And it's very efficient to manage a building with that experience. But it does come down to people. A couple of good people inside a building can maintain it for decades, if not centuries. And that kind of contract lives on. And so I think understanding this not as like just a symbol of like church design and our history, but also understanding this is a physical machine, just like every other building is, but it's physical materials that have to be maintained. It's fresh air that has to flow. It's electricity. It's the complicated engineering systems that Jonathan and I have been down to the basement to see that neither one of us quite fully understand, but there are blinking lights, which we think we know what they mean. And so I think getting a grip on that, committing ourselves to that, and making sure that we preserve this building, because I think if you look around our American culture, there's a lot of things that we don't necessarily love. There are a lot of buildings that we could lose and not miss them. And then there's a lot of buildings that we have lost, and we do miss them. But I think it's partly churches and their ability to come together around their structures that allows us to keep those things that are very important to us, and keep a lot of ourselves too. So thank you to Jonathan for the hard work, and thank you to all of you. So.
Thank you, Leif.